The first thing I heard was the click of the cuff closing, and then the young man's own voice, far too pleased with itself, announcing to a phone screen that he would not be moved. I had come to the forecourt of Renholt Palace that morning to do nothing more dangerous than eat a pastry on a stone bench and watch the guard change. And instead I watched a stranger lock his wrist to the gilded railing in front of the sentry box and tell the world he was a prisoner of conscience. He was not a prisoner of anything yet. That came later, and it came in a way none of us standing there could have written, least of all him. My name is Eldon Cray. I am 51, a retired surveyor, and I keep a small habit of arriving early to public places so I can sit before the crowds do. That is the only reason I had a clear line of sight to the whole thing from the start. I want to set it down plainly, because by nightfall there were 100 clipped versions of it racing across the internet, and most of them got the shape of it wrong. They made the guard the straight man and the young man the hero. I was there. It was the other way around, and the truth of it was better than any of the edits. The young man called himself a name I will not bother repeating, because the name was the whole point of him. He wanted it said. He had arrived in a coat that was meant to look poor and was not, with a small expensive camera clamped to his chest, and a second phone propped on a folding tripod he set up against the base of the railing as if the cobbles belonged to him. He was perhaps 26. He moved the way men move when they have practiced moving, every gesture aimed at a lens. And he had chosen his spot with care, directly in front of the guardsman who stood the near post, so that every frame he shot would have that immaculate red figure behind him, motionless, lending him the gravity he did not own. The guard's name I learned only afterward. That morning he was simply the man in the red wool tunic, and the tall black bearskin, white gloves crossed at his front over the rifle, chin strap dividing his jaw, eyes fixed on a point across the forecourt that none of the rest of us could see. He stood the way they all stand, which is to say he stood like the railing itself, like something cast rather than born. The young man clipped one handcuff to his own wrist, threaded the other through a bar of the railing barely astride from the guard's boots, and let it close with that small, awful, final click. "You can't make me leave," he told the camera, smiling. "I have a right to be here. He has to stand there. I have to stand here. We'll see who breaks first." I remember thinking, even then, that he had badly mistaken what kind of contest he had entered. He thought it was a contest of endurance, who could outlast whom in the cold. It was nothing of the kind. The guard was not enduring anything. The guard was simply at work, and the work did not include the young man at all. That was the thing the young man could not bear, and the thing he kept trying to fix all morning. He could not get the guard to acknowledge that the contest existed. The crowd thickened fast. By 9:30 there were maybe 60 of us pressed along the line, and the young man's voice rose to meet the audience he'd been waiting for. He had a small speaker now, tucked at his feet, and he played it low under his own narration, something about how the palace was a relic, how the men who stood its gates were costumed mannequins kept on display, how he, by chaining himself to their precious railing, was exposing the whole charade. He was articulate, I will give him that. He had the cadence of a man who had said all of this many times to a mirror. A woman near me, holding a child's hand, asked him quietly to mind his language, and he turned the camera on her instead and asked her if she enjoyed living in a country that paid grown men to play dress-up at a gate. She flushed and pulled the child away. The young man grinned at the lens. He had what he wanted, a small, clean clip of an ordinary person made to look foolish. He set it aside in a folder he announced out loud, for the edit. That was when I understood he was not protesting anything. He was harvesting. The railing, the guard, the cold, the crowd, the woman with the child, all of it was raw material for a video that did not exist yet, and the only thing the video needed to succeed was a reaction from the man in red. So he set about getting one. First he simply talked at him. He stood as close as the cuff allowed, his face a hand's breadth from the guard's shoulder, and narrated the guard's appearance to the camera in a low private murmur, as though the guard were an exhibit behind glass. The bearskin, he said, was the pelt of a real animal. Did we know that? The rifle, he said, probably wasn't even loaded. The medals, he said, were handed out for standing still. The guard did not move. Not the eyes, not the jaw, not the gloved hands on the rifle. A small wind came across the forecourt and lifted the fur of the bearskin and laid it down again, and that was the only motion in the whole tall figure. The young man's smile thinned by a degree. He had expected, I think, that proximity alone would crack the surface. It didn't. So he raised his voice. He began to count down theatrically as though the guard were a bomb. 3, he said, 2, 1, flinch, nothing. He clapped his free hand hard once an inch from the guard's ear. Nothing. He waved his fingers across the line of the guard's gaze. The eyes did not follow. By now a good portion of the crowd had stopped finding him amusing. I watched the faces around me settle into a kind of cold patience, the patience of people watching someone make a long, slow mistake and deciding not to interrupt it. The phones were out, but more of them were pointed at the young man than he realized. He thought he was the one recording. He was, in fact, the most recorded man in the city that morning, and almost none of the lenses were on his side. Then a sergeant came. He came at the unhurried pace those men keep even when the situation is anything but unhurried, a broader figure in the same uniform with a different bearing in the shoulders, and he stopped a respectful distance from the cuffed young man and spoke to him in a voice pitched so that only the front of the crowd could hear it. I was in the front of the crowd. "Sir," the sergeant said, "you are obstructing the post and you are attached to royal property. You will be given the chance to remove yourself. I would advise you take it." The young man turned the camera on him and his face lit like a struck match. This, the sergeant, the warning, the official weight of it, this was content. "Are you threatening me?" he said, delighted loud for the folder. "You all saw that. He threatened me. I'm not resisting, I'm peaceful, I'm chained to a fence and this man is threatening me." He held up his cuffed wrist to the lens like a trophy. "I'm not going anywhere. You'll have to drag me. Film that, film all of it. This is exactly what I came for." He had no idea how completely he was about to get it. The sergeant did not rise to the bait. That was the first lesson of the morning, and the young man missed it entirely. He had built his whole performance on the assumption that authority, when pushed, pushes back loudly, that the men of the palace were brittle, proud creatures who could be tipped into a shout or a shove with the right needling, and that the shove would be the climax of his film. But the sergeant simply nodded, as if the young man had agreed to something reasonable, and said, "Very well, you've been advised. The process will take the time it takes, and you will be a part of it whether you wish to be or not." Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, at that same unhurried pace, and spoke quietly into a radio at his collar. "Where's he going?" the young man called after him, and for the first time there was a thread of something under the bravado, not fear, not yet, but the small unease of a man who had expected a door to slam and instead heard it click softly shut. Hey, you can't just leave me here. I'm a person. I have rights." "Nobody's leaving you," I said before I could stop myself. I don't know why I spoke. I am not a man who speaks to strangers in crowds, but there was something in his voice that pulled it out of me, the same way you'd answer a child who has wandered too far and is pretending not to be lost. That's the whole point. You locked yourself to it. Now you're part of it. He swung the camera at me, ready with a retort, and then seemed to decide I wasn't worth the folder and turned back to the guard. The guard, of course, had not moved through any of it. What he did next I have thought about many times since. He had been trying to break the guard's stillness from the outside, with noise, with proximity, with insult. Now he changed his angle. He began, in a lowered and almost tender voice, to tell the camera a story about the guard. He invented it as he went. He said the man behind him was a cog, a poor lad from some forgotten town, trapped in a meaningless ritual, too brainwashed to know he was being used, too disciplined to admit he was miserable. He said it gently, as though he pitied him. He said the real cruelty of the palace was not its arrogance but its waste, All these strong young men frozen into ornaments. And as he said it, he watched the guard's face sidelong, hungry, waiting for the words to land, waiting for some flicker of hurt or anger to cross that fixed expression and justify the whole sermon. The guard's eyes stayed on their distant point. But I was close enough to see what the young man could not, angled wrong as he was. I saw the faint, deliberate steadiness in the guard's jaw that is not the absence of feeling but the mastery of it. That man heard every word. He had simply decided, long before this morning, that there was no insult a stranger could offer that was worth more than his post. The young man thought silence meant emptiness. It meant the opposite. It meant a fullness so complete that nothing the young man could get inside it. The crowd felt it too, even those who couldn't have put it into words. I watched the mood along the line harden into something the young man would have hated if he'd had the eyes to read it. A man in a work jacket muttered, "Leave the lad alone." An older woman said louder, "He's doing his job, you're the only one making a fool of yourself." The young man wheeled the camera on her, hunting for another clean clip of an ordinary citizen embarrassed, but this time it didn't work. She didn't flush. She looked straight into the lens and said, "Go on, put me in your little film, I'll say it again." A few people laughed, not at her, at him. And that laugh was the first crack in the morning, though it was his composure it cracked, not the guard's. He recovered fast. Men like him always do in the short run. He announced to the camera that the establishment crowd was turning hostile, that he was being intimidated, that this was exactly the suppression he'd come to expose. He narrated his own bravery in the third person. And then, because the guard still would not give him the reaction his whole enterprise depended on, he did the thing that turned the morning from a nuisance into a matter for the law. He reached out with his free hand and he knocked the rifle. It was not a hard blow. I want to be fair even now. He flicked the barrel with the back of his fingers, the way you'd flick a wind chime, a small contemptuous tap meant to be cute on camera. Look, the toy soldier's toy gun. But a rifle is not a wind chime and a guardsman's weapon is not a prop, and the instant his fingers touched it the air on the forecourt changed. I felt it go through the crowd like a drop in pressure before a storm. Several people stopped filming the young man and started, properly, to watch. The guard moved. It was the smallest movement I have ever seen carry so much weight. He brought the rifle in tight against his body, a single clean motion, controlled to the inch, and he turned his head, just his head, and looked at the young man directly for the first time all morning. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look was not anger. It was something far more unsettling to be on the wrong end of. It was the level, unhurried attention of a man who has just cataloged exactly what you did, exactly when, and exactly what it will cost you, and who is in no hurry at all because the cost is already certain. Then he faced front again and resumed his stillness, and the whole thing had taken perhaps 2 seconds. The young man laughed, but the laugh came out wrong, half a beat too late. "Did you see that? He moved. I made him move." He said it to the camera, but he said it to convince himself. He had wanted a reaction for an hour, and he had finally gotten one, and it had not felt at all the way he'd imagined. It had felt like standing too close to a furnace door that someone has just quietly latched. "Sir," the sergeant was back, and this time he was not alone. A second guardsman had come with him, and behind them, at the edge of the forecourt, 2 of the palace police were walking up, not running, never running, just covering the ground with that flat official certainty that tells you the unhurried part of the morning is over. The sergeant's voice was the same as before, but the words had changed. "You have now made contact with the weapon of a sentry on duty. That is no longer a matter of moving along. You understand that what happens next is not up to you." "It was a tap," the young man said. "It was nothing. You can't be serious." For the first time the camera wavered in his grip. "I'm chained to a fence. I'm not a threat to anybody." "No," the sergeant agreed, "you're not. And you are chained to the king's railing, which means before anyone can speak to you about what you've done, someone has to cut you free of it. We'll see to that. Stand as still as you can manage. It's safer for your wrist." I watched the words reach him one at a time. Cut you free. He had locked himself to that bar to prove no one could move him. And now the only way he was leaving was for the very people he'd been mocking to come with bolt cutters and free him from his own clever trap, in front of every lens on the forecourt, including all the ones he'd never noticed were pointed at him. His mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. What came out after a moment was a fresh performance, because performance was the only language he had. He turned to the crowd, to all of us, arms spread as wide as the cuff allowed, the picture of a wronged man, and declared that we were witnessing the machinery of oppression in real time, that they were going to cut a peaceful protester out of his chains and arrest him for the crime of standing still, that this clip alone would be worth everything. He kept calling it a clip. Even then, even as the police took their unhurried positions, the only frame he could see the world through was the one inside his own lens. The trouble was that the crowd had stopped agreeing with him entirely, and he could not feel it happening. A young couple near me had been broadly sympathetic when he first chained himself. I'd heard them say he had a point about the cost of all this pageantry. They weren't saying it now. The woman said low, "He hit the man's rifle. You don't touch a soldier's weapon. That's not a protest, that's just being a fool." The man beside her nodded, and I noticed, quietly turned his phone so it was filming the young man's face full on. So did a dozen others. The forecourt had become a ring of witnesses, and the young man stood at the center of it, convinced he was the only one with a camera, convinced the story would be his to cut. A palace police officer crouched beside the railing with a long pair of bolt cutters. He did not address the young man's speech at all. He spoke only about the wrist, keep it loose, turn the palm up, this will take a moment, the steel will be warm where I cut it. He had clearly done this before for far less theatrical reasons, and his calm was its own kind of authority. The young man, who had been begging to be dragged off in chains, now flinched at the nearness of the tool that would unchain him. "Careful," he said. "Be careful, that's my hand." And the absurdity of it reached even him for a half-second. He had locked his own hand to a fence, and then complained that strangers were being careless with it. And I saw the half-second cross his face before the camera pulled him back into character. The cutter bit. There was a single hard snap, louder than the morning warranted, and the cuff fell open against the gilded bar with a small bright clatter, and the young man's wrist came free, trailing a short length of broken steel still locked to his skin. He held it up at once for the lens, the dangling cuff, the ruined dramatic prop, and he tried to make it look like a manacle struck off a martyr. It did not look like that. It looked like exactly what it was. A man who had spent good money on handcuffs to imprison himself for attention, being released by the patient hands of the very institution he'd come to humiliate. Somewhere behind me, a man said it out loud, dry as dust, "Saved by the toy soldiers' mates." And the laugh that went around the front of the crowd this time was not cruel so much as it was final. It was the laugh of people who have watched a long bluff called and found nothing underneath. The young man heard that laugh. I watched it land. For the first time all morning his face did something his camera was not pointed at, because he had let the camera drop to his side without realizing it. He looked, for one unguarded instant, very young and very lost, a performer who has finished his act and stepped to the front of the stage for the applause and heard, instead, the sound of an audience deciding he was ridiculous. Then the instant passed, and he hauled the mask back up and started narrating again. But it was thinner now. There was a hollowness behind the words. He had built a whole self out of the certainty that he could provoke any room, and the stillest man on the forecourt had just declined to be provoked, and the room had noticed which of them looked the bigger fool. Through every second of it the guard stood his post. I keep coming back to that. The cutting, the clatter, the laughter, the police, the speeches, all of it happened in the narrow strip of cobbles directly in front of him, close enough that the broken cuff had fallen near his boot, and he did not so much as glance down. His was the one face on that whole forecourt with nothing to perform and nothing to prove. He had a point to watch across the square, and he watched it. And the longer the chaos churned at his feet and the longer he held, the clearer it became to everyone present which of the two men had actually been free this whole time, and which had locked himself to a fence and called it freedom. The police got the young man to his feet. He came up still talking, still filming when he remembered the phone in his hand, narrating his own arrest as a triumph even as the words found fewer and fewer ears. "This is going to be the biggest thing I've ever posted," he told the Lens. "You're all part of history. Remember where you were." A woman beside me said, not unkindly, to no one in particular, "I'll remember, love. I just don't think you'll like how." He didn't hear her. He was already composing the caption. They walked him toward the edge of the forecourt, an officer at each shoulder, neither gripping hard, neither needing to. Where, after all, was he going to run, in front of 100 cameras, away from the moment he'd spent weeks engineering? And here is the detail the edits all cut, the detail I most want set down. As they led him past the near post, he turned his head one last time toward the guard, and I cannot prove it, but I was close and I believe it. I think he was waiting even then for the guard to gloat, for a smirk, for a flicker of satisfaction he could capture and use, the smug establishment enjoying his downfall, one last clip to salvage the day. He needed the guard to be small. His whole story required it. The guard gave him nothing. Not contempt, not triumph, not even the dignity of a glance. The guard simply stood, exactly as he had stood when the morning began, exactly as he would stand when it ended, his eyes on the far point, the rifle at his front, the bearskin catching that small wind and laying it down again. To the guard, the young man had never been an opponent, never been a story, never been anything but a disturbance that the proper people would handle in the proper order. And there is no insult on earth so complete as being, in the end, simply not important enough to look at. The young man had come to prove the guard was a hollow ornament. The guard had answered without a single word, by demonstrating that the hollow one was him. That was the moment the morning truly turned, and not one camera caught the heart of it, because the heart of it was a thing that did not move. They put him in the back of a quiet car at the edge of the square. The crowd did not jeer. That surprised me. I had half expected an ugly mood, the kind that turns a man's mistake into a mob sport, but it didn't come. The people simply watched, and then began to drift back to the railing and the ordinary marvel of the guard, the thing they'd actually come to see, the thing that had been there the whole time underneath the noise. The sergeant came back through the line and asked us courteously to step back behind the marked stones, and we did. And within minutes the forecourt looked exactly as it had at 9 o'clock, as if nothing had happened at all, except for one bright broken handcuff still lying on the cobbles near a guardsman's boot, which a police officer presently bent and collected into a clear bag, and labeled, and carried away as the single most important thing the young man had brought with him that day. I went home and I did not think much more about it. I assumed it was over. I have learned since how naive that was, because nothing is over any more the moment it touches a camera, and that morning had touched 100 of them. The first version went up within the hour, and it was the young man's own. He had managed somehow to post from the back of the car before they took the phone, or perhaps a Confederate had it, I never learned which. The clip was titled The Way Men Like Him Title Things, all capitals and the word brutal in it, and it was cut exactly as I'd feared it would be. It opened on the bolt cutters. It opened on the snap of the steel and his own raised wrist and the dangling cuff, and over it he had laid his voice, breathless and triumphant, declaring that the palace had arrested a peaceful protester for daring to question its pageantry. It did not show the rifle. It did not show his fingers on the rifle. It did not show the woman with the child, or the older woman who'd faced down his lens, or the laugh, or the long hour of needling that had earned him every cold second of what followed. It showed a martyr in chains and a wall of red-coated menace. For about 90 minutes it worked. The numbers climbed. The comments filled with the easy outrage he traded in. He had, by his own measure, won. Then the other cameras woke up. This is the part the young man never accounted for, and it is, I have come to think, the truest justice the morning produced, truer than any charge a court could read. He had spent the whole hour believing he was the only author of the day, the one man with the lens and the edit, and the right to shape what it meant. But 100 strangers had stood on that forecourt with phones, and 100 strangers went home with footage, and one by one through that afternoon they began to put it up. The work jacket man's footage, the older woman's, the young couple's, the one filming him full in the face, a tourist's from a high angle that caught the whole hour in one unbroken sweep, and every one of them showed what his edit had buried. They showed the woman with the child being mocked. They showed the long, patient, almost tender attempt by the sergeant to let him walk away clean, and his gleeful refusal of it. They showed, above all, the flick of his fingers against the rifle, that small, contemptuous tap, caught from 4 different angles, undeniable, the exact instant a publicity stunt became a crime. And they showed the guard, the stillness of him through all of it, the single, controlled motion of the rifle coming in tight, and the one level look, and the return to stone. People watched that look and understood, the way the front of the crowd had understood in person, that the young man had picked a fight with a man who had simply declined to have it, and lost anyway comprehensively in front of everyone. The thing turned over the course of a single evening. I watched it happen with the strange, queasy feeling of a man who knows the inside of a story the whole country is suddenly arguing about. His triumphant clip became, within hours, the most mocked thing in the city. Someone laid his own breathless voiceover, "Palace arrests a peaceful protester," over the footage of him flicking the rifle and giggling, so that his own narration indicted him. Someone else made a short, devastating cut of every angle of him counting down at the motionless guard, 3, 2, 1, flinch, followed by the guard not flinching, set to no music at all, just the wind. That one I must have seen shared 40 times before midnight. The captions wrote themselves. He had wanted to be famous for breaking the unbreakable man. He became famous, instead, as the man who chained himself to a fence, lost a staring contest to a person who never agreed to have one, and had to be cut loose by the very people he'd come to mock. The cuffs he'd brought to dramatize his courage became the whole punchline. He had brought his own cell to the palace and locked himself into it for the world to watch. By the next morning the brand he'd built was coming apart in his hands. He had sponsors, men like him always do, and the sponsors read the room the way sponsors always read the room, which is to say overnight and without sentiment. The first one withdrew before breakfast, in a statement that managed to use the words integrity and disappointed in the same sentence while saying nothing at all. The others followed within the day, the way a row of dominoes follows the first. The accounts that had cheered his martyr clip at noon were, by the following noon, the loudest voices replaying the rifle tap. That is the nature of the audience he had courted his whole short career. It has no loyalty, only appetite, and the day it discovered he was funnier as a fool than thrilling as a hero, it ate him without a flicker of regret. He had spent years feeding it. He had simply never imagined being on the plate. I am not a cruel man, and I want to say plainly that I took no joy in his unraveling. There was something genuinely sad in it. A young man with real wit and real nerve who had aimed all of it at the cheapest possible target and missed even that. But I will not pretend the country was wrong to laugh, because the laugh was, in its way, the correct verdict. He had tried to make a still man look ridiculous, and a watching nation had decided, on the evidence, that the still man was not the ridiculous one. The crowd's footage was the trial, the mockery was the sentence, and both arrived long before he ever stood in front of an actual magistrate. But he did stand in front of one. That part was quieter and it came later, and almost no one filmed it, which is perhaps why it has stuck with me most of all. The charge, when it was read, was not the grand persecution he'd advertised. There was nothing in it about conscience or pageantry or the right to question power. It was small and exact and unanswerable. He had attached himself to royal property without leave and refused lawful instruction to remove himself. and he had made physical contact with the weapon of a sentry on active duty, a thing the law takes seriously not because the rifle is sacred, but because the man holding it is, because a sentry's weapon and a sentry's composure are the two halves of how a single unarmed-looking figure keeps a gate that 100 people could otherwise rush. To touch that rifle in jest is to gamble with the one thing standing between order and a crush, and the law does not find the jest funny. The magistrate did not find it funny either. I went to the hearing. I am not sure why. Curiosity partly, and partly the surveyor's old instinct to see a thing measured properly to its end. The room was small and bright and almost empty, a few clerks, a reporter or two, a handful of the merely curious like me. The young man came in without his camera for the first time since I'd laid eyes on him, and the difference was startling. Without the lens to play to, he seemed smaller and more ordinary, a tired young man in a plain suit, the practiced gestures all stilled because there was no longer anyone to perform them for. The court does not have a comment section. It does not care for cadence. It asks only what you did, and whether you did it, and the young man, to his small credit, when the moment came, did not try to make a clip of his own defense. Perhaps he had finally learned what the guard could have told him on the first morning, that there are rooms in which performance is not currency, and that the man in red had been standing in one of them the whole time. He admitted it. He said the words quietly. He had attached himself to the railing. He had been asked to leave and had refused. He had touched the rifle. He said he had meant it as theater and understood now that it had not been received as theater, and for one moment, hearing him, I thought he might actually understand the thing itself and not merely its consequences. The magistrate gave him a fine that was substantial without being ruinous, and a short suspended term that would land on him hard the next time he mistook a public servant's patience for a stage, and in order to keep well clear of the palace and its people. And then the magistrate said something I have carried with me ever since, something not in any of the clips because no clip survives a room with no cameras in it. You came to that gate to prove the man standing it was an empty thing, a costume, a relic, a fool kept on display. You have instead given the clearest possible demonstration of the opposite. For an hour you did everything a man can do to break another man's composure, and he did not break because his composure was not a pose he was holding for a crowd. It was a discipline he had made into a self. You wanted him to be hollow so that mocking him would mean something. He was not hollow. You were merely loud. There is a difference, and this country has spent the week learning it at your expense. Go home, and the next time you meet a man who does not need to react to you, consider that he may have understood something about strength that you have not. The young man said nothing. There was nothing to say. He left by a side door, away from the few cameras that had gathered outside, and as far as I know he was never heard from in the loud way again. I hope, somewhere, he is well and quieter. I mean that. I learned the guard's name afterward, though it does not matter much and he would, I think, prefer it didn't. He was a sergeant's man with 11 years in, a record without a single mark on it, a man who had stood that same post through a coronation, a state funeral, a snowstorm, and 3 separate fools before this one, and who had treated all 4 the same, which is to say, as weather. When a reporter finally reached him for a comment, in the brief season when the whole country wanted to crown him a hero, he gave 4 words, and they were the only 4 words from the entire affair that I have committed to memory whole. He said, "I was at work." That was all. I was at work. No speech about discipline, no lecture on respect, no victory lap. He did not think he had won anything because to him there had been no contest. A man had locked himself to his railing and behaved badly, and others had come and dealt with it in the proper order. And through all of it, he had done the one thing he was there to do, which was to stand his post and let nothing, not insult, not noise, not 100 cameras, not the chance to be celebrated, pull him off the point he was set to watch. The young man had spent weeks engineering a moment and a month chasing its wreckage. The guard had spent the morning the way he spent every morning, and had moved exactly twice, and only when it was right too, and that was the whole of his part. The discipline that the young man had come to ridicule turned out to be the only thing on that forecourt that the noise could not touch. I have thought a great deal in the year since about why the country took to it the way it did, why a small scuffle at a gate became a thing strangers told one another about for weeks. I think it is because most of us spend our lives being provoked. Not at gilded railings, but at desks and dinner tables and in the long gray traffic of ordinary days, by people who want to rise out of us, who measure their own importance by whether they can make us flinch. And most of us flinch. We take the bait, we raise our voices, we hand the loud man exactly the reaction he came for and call it standing up for ourselves, and we feel afterward vaguely used because we were. And then once in a while, we see a man who simply will not be drawn, who is so wholly occupied with what actually matters that the provoker cannot find a single handle to grip, and something in us recognizes that this, and not the shouting, is what strength has always looked like. The guard gave the country a picture of the thing it wanted to be and rarely is. That is why it could not stop watching him. He was the answer to a question we are all asked every day and usually fail. The young man had it backward from the first click of the cuff. He thought the contest was who would break, and he thought the man trained not to react was the weak one, the trapped one, the one with everything to lose. But it was the young man who was chained to the lens, to the numbers, to the bottomless need for a reaction that was never enough and never would be. And it was the guard who was free, free in the one way that cannot be filmed, the freedom of a man who answers to something steadier than a crowd. The handcuffs the young man brought to the palace were the truest thing about him, and he was wearing them long before he ever clicked one shut on that bar. The morning only made them visible. I still go to the forecourt early on quiet mornings to sit on my bench before the crowds come. The railing is just a railing again. The bright broken cuff is in an evidence room somewhere, or a landfill, gone the way of every prop. And the guard, or one like him, in the same red wool, under the same tall bearskin, white gloves crossed at the front over the rifle, stands the near post with his eyes on a point across the square that the rest of us cannot see and were never meant to. People come and go in front of him all day. Some are kind and some are foolish and a rare few are cruel, and he treats all of it as weather, because that is the discipline, and the discipline is the man. I tip my hat to him now when I pass, though he never returns it and I would think less of him if he did. He is at work. He was always only at work, and I have learned, late and from a stranger in a too nice poor man's coat, that there is no statement a loud man can make from the front of a crowd half so powerful as the one a still man makes by refusing to be moved from the spot where he knows he is supposed to stand.